Learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Welcome. So, if you're joining us as maybe an overseas university student just starting out with Japanese history, well, you've picked a really interesting spot to jump in.
Yeah, definitely. Today we're doing a deep dive into the Azuchi-Momoyama period. That's the late 16th century, a time of huge change.
Azuchi-Momoyama. You hear that name a lot. It comes from castles, right?
That's it. Oda Nobunaga's Azuchi Castle and Toyotomi Hideyoshi's castle, Momoyama, in Fushimi. Fun fact, the Momoyama bit actually means Peach Mountain.
Peach Mountain.
Yeah, apparently they planted peach trees all around the ruins of Hideyoshi's castle there. So the name stuck.
Huh. Okay, but it wasn't just about peaches. This was a massive turning point for Japan.
Oh, absolutely. After, centuries of conflict, things were finally starting to unify.
Yeah.
And that brought massive social shifts.
Like the rise of new leaders, the daimyo.
Exactly. New daimyo, powerful ones were popping up.
Yeah.
And some came from, well, pretty humble beginnings. Lower samurai ranks, even the peasantry.
Wow, really? So not just the old noble families anymore.
Not necessarily. Merit and, frankly, military success played a huge role. It made the whole political scene much more dynamic, maybe a bit unstable too.
And it wasn't just the warriors, right? Merchants were gaining power too.
Yeah, definitely. Wealthy merchants really started to flex their economic muscles. Commerce was booming.
So you've got these new leaders, new money. That must have really shaken up the culture.
It did. It fostered this incredibly vibrant, sort of new artistic energy.
Okay, so let's get into that. What makes Momoyama culture?
Well, Momoyama culture.
Well, one big thing is you see less of that really heavy Buddhist influence that marked earlier times. People seemed more interested in worldly things, pleasures, life right now.
And the European connection. Nanban culture.
Huge impact. Traders, missionaries, mostly Portuguese at this point, they brought in totally new ideas, goods, things that really left a mark.
Okay, let's start with the buildings. Architecture feels like a good way in. Castles were key.
Right.
Oh, absolutely, the defining architectural form. These weren't just forts. They were massive symbols of power.
Picture these incredible stone walls.
Right, built up for defense, but then topped with these magnificent central keeps, the Tenchukaku. They were command centers, sure, but also just pure statements, showing off the Lord's authority.
And inside, just as fancy.
Even more so, maybe.
Hmm.
The living spaces for the daimyo were just dripping with decoration. Elaborate carvings, super colorful paintings, showing off their wealth and taste.
And this is where we get those amazing painted walls and doors, shichikiga.
Exactly, that's the term. Mural paintings right on the sliding doors, fusuma, and walls. Especially in the grand audience halls, they were just spectacular.
The Kano school painters were the big names here, weren't they?
The leading force, yeah. Artists like Kano Aitoku and then Kano Senraku, their style is really distinct.
What does it look like?
Think bold. Really dynamic designs, like big, powerful waves sometimes, lots of bright, rich colors. And often this was all set against shimmering gold leaf backgrounds.
Gold leaf on doors and screens.
On the fusuma doors and the folding screens, baibu, yeah. Imagine walking into a room like that. It must have been absolutely dazzling, awe-inspiring.
Wow. Can we still see any of this today?
We're lucky, yes. Nisho Castle in Kyoto, the Ninomaru Palace there, that's a prime example.
Tokugawa Ieyasu built that, right, as his place in Kyoto.
That's the one. And it's interesting, it's a Hirajiro, a castle built on flat land. Different strategic thinking than one on a hill.
And it's in that Shoinzukuri style.
A classic example of Shoinzukuri residential architecture. Grand exterior, equally fancy inside. Plus, the Ninomaru Garden is famous too, a beautiful daimyo garden.
You can visit it today, right? It's part of the larger Nijo Castle complex.
Yep. Then there's Himeji Castle, maybe you know its nickname, Shirasagyo.
The Egret Castle, because it's so white and elegant.
Exactly. Ikeda Teramasa built it after the Battle of Sekigahara, finished around 1609. Now, unlike Nijo, Himeji is on a hill, Himeyama Hill. So it's a Hirayama-jiro.
Using the terrain for defense.
Right. And Himeji isn't just one tower. It's this amazing complex, multiple keeps all connected. A Renritsushiki Tenshukaku-gun.
Sounds complicated.
Looks incredible, though.
Yeah.
And the main keep, the Hanmaru and the West Bailey, Nishinomaru, they're still standing. It's remarkably well preserved.
Amazing. Any others?
Well, there's the West Honganji Shoin, specifically a room called the Hainama.
The Room of the Flying Geese.
That's it. It's in Honganji Temple in Kyoto. A huge audience hall, something like 200 tatami mats in total, upper and lower sections.
Why flying geese?
Because of these beautiful carvings of geese on the ranma, that decorative panel above the sliding doors. It's just incredibly grand, pure Momoyama majesty.
Okay, so the rulers lived in splendor. What about everyone else? The townspeople?
Well, culture wasn't just for the elite. You had this really vibrant scene emerging among the wealthy townspeople, too, the Mashishu,
Especially in the big cities, Kyoto, Osaka.
Sakai, Hakata, too. These merchant families, they had money from trade, and they had taste. They really got into the arts.
Arts that had been around for a while, like tea ceremony.
Exactly. Things like tea ceremony,
Yeah.
sadhu, flower arranging, kadu, no theater, Kyogen comedies. They were still super popular, but the townspeople put their own stamp on them.
Let's talk about the tea ceremony. Sen no Riki is the key figure here, isn't he?
Absolutely central. He's the one credited with perfecting the wabi-cha style.
Wabi-cha. That's the more rustic, simple style.
Emphasizing simplicity, austerity. Finding beauty in imperfection, you could say.
Which is kind of fascinating, given all the gold leaf and grandeur we were just talking about.
It is. It shows this other side, this appreciation for the natural, the unadorned, existing right alongside the extravagance. It was a very influential counterpoint.
And Riki wasn't the only one.
No. Other important figures, even powerful daimyo like Oda Urakusai and Furuta Oribe, they founded their own schools of tea, each with slightly different philosophies and styles.
And this focus on tea must have spurred demand for ceramics, tea bowls and things.
Definitely. And this period saw really beautiful new styles emerge. A lot of this was actually thanks to Korean plotters.
Korean potters.
Yeah, many were brought over by daimyo during the campaigns in Korea. They settled in places like Arita, Satsuma, Hagi, Hirado.
And started making ceramics there.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
These places became famous for producing really elegant, refined teaware. It shows how interconnected things were, even then.
Okay, so tea culture was big. What about other entertainment for common folk?
Popular entertainment got a lot richer, too.
Yeah.
You have the story of Izumo no Okuni.
Yes, tell us about her.
Well, she shows up in Kyoto right around the start of the 17th century. And she starts performing this totally new kind of dance.
What was so new about it?
The really striking thing. She dressed as a man, even carried a sword.
Whoa, how did people react to that?
They loved it. It was unconventional, exciting. It really captured the public's imagination, challenged norms.
And this became kabuki.
The very beginnings. It was called Kabuki Odori or Okuni Kabuki.
Yeah.
Hugely popular. And it eventually led to all-female kabuki troupes later on.
Fascinating. What else was popular?
Puppet theater. Minju Jururi. That really took off too.
Puppets telling stories.
Yeah, accompanied by sung narration, these Jururi ballads. And the music was often played on the shamisen.
The three-stringed instrument.
That's the one. It actually came over from the Ryukyu Kingdom, Okinawa. So you had puppets, singing, music, a whole multimedia experience, really.
A real mix of arts. And simpler stuff, too, like folk dancing.
Oh, yeah, Bonadori, the dances for the Bon Festival. That was practiced widely, a real community thing in different regions.
So daily life was changing, too, not just the arts.
Definitely. Even houses started to look different in the cities, like Kyoto. You start seeing two-story buildings more often.
And tile roofs.
Yeah, tile roofs became more common, replacing thatch or wood shingles in urban areas.
What about clothes?
Fashion changed, too. The kosode, which is basically the forerunner of the modern kimono, became the standard garment.
For everyone.
Pretty much. Especially women. They often wore it in a style called koso koshimaki, where it was worn sort of like an outer robe.
And hairstyles. Less formal headwear.
Right. Women started tying their hair up in more complex styles. Men mostly stopped wearing the formal eboshi hats and just went with a top knot, the mage.
We even have pictures or descriptions, right? Like of Oichi no Kata?
Yeah, Oda Nobunaga's sister.
Yeah.
There are depictions of her wearing an uchikaki, a really elaborate outer robe, but draped off the shoulders and wrapped at the waist, that koshimaki style. Gives you a real visual.
It paints quite a picture of the era. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. You mentioned tea earlier. Its journey beyond Japan is pretty interesting too, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It connects Momoyama culture to world history in a really direct way.
How so? When did Europeans first encounter tea?
Well, it seems like the mid-16th century. And the story goes, it was Jesuit missionaries seeing the Japanese tea ceremony.
So the very formal Japanese way of tea was their first glimpse.
Apparently so. For you listening, maybe familiar with tea in Europe or elsewhere, this is where those first connections might have started. Kind of amazing.
But it took a while to catch on back in Europe.
It did. It wasn't until 1610 that the Dutch East India Company actually started importing Japanese green tea to Europe regularly.
And the Dutch spread it around.
From the Netherlands, yeah, it slowly moved to other countries.
Yeah.
Though in France, coffee was already popular and cheaper, so tea had a tougher time there.
What kind of tea were they drinking initially?
Mostly Chinese green tea, actually. And they often added sugar and milk.
Which is very different from the Japanese ceremony.
Very different. Then you get the British shift towards black tea.
Why black tea?
Well, the story often links it to a Portuguese queen, Catherine of Braganza, who married Charles II of England. She apparently loved tea and had an interest in Asian culture. And black tea is fermented, unlike green tea.
So Britain went big on black tea.
Eventually, yes. Interestingly, in the early 18th century, green tea was still more popular in Britain. But by the mid-1700s, it completely flipped.
How much did it flip?
The British East India Company's imports were something like 2/3 black tea and only 1/3 green tea by then.
And the British drink a lot of tea, right?
An astonishing amount. Reports say Britain consumed maybe 3 times as much tea as all other European countries put together.
Wow, that's commitment.
And later on, the Suez Canal, opening in the late 19th century, made it easier to bring in tea from India, not just China. That really cemented Britain's tea culture.
You could almost see tea as a symbol of British sea power back then.
It's not a stretch, yeah. Okay, one more major influence to cover, Nan-ban culture.
Right, the southern barbarian culture, the European influence.
Exactly. Trade was flourishing, missionaries were active, and this led to regular people adopting some European styles, clothing, even food.
And language. We still use words borrowed from that time.
Loads of them. Think kappa for a raincoat, cassatera sponge cake, Kumpit, those little sugar candies.
Pan for bread.
Pan for bread, exactly. All came in during this period from Portuguese or Spanish.
What else did they bring?
Well, tobacco was introduced then, too. Became popular pretty quickly.
Beyond just goods, though. Ideas. Skills.
Oh, yes. Missionaries brought practical knowledge, astronomy, medicine, geography, and new art techniques, too.
Like oil painting.
Oil painting, copperplate engraving.
Yeah.
Japanese artists started experimenting with these, creating unique Nan-ban folding screens that blended Japanese and European styles.
And printing. That was huge.
Very significant. The missionaries introduced movable-type printing presses.
What did they print?
Christian texts, naturally, but also Japanese classics, like the Tale of Heike, even Aesop's fables. These are called Kirishitanben, or Amakusaban editions.
So European tech printing Japanese stories.
Yeah.
Oh.
And it's worth remembering, movable type also came in from Korea around this time, used for printing other books too. So a lot happening with printing technology.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. The Momoyama period. It was just packed with change.
Absolutely. You had this incredible grand castle architecture
Yeah.
symbolizing new power.
Right. And at the same time, this flourishing culture among the townspeople, tea ceremony evolving, kabuki and puppet theater getting started.
Popular entertainment becoming much richer. Plus, we saw how something like tea connected Japan globally.
And that fascinating layer of Nanban culture, bringing in European words, foods, art techniques, leaving a real lasting imprint.
It really was such a dynamic time, a bridge, you could say, between Japan's medieval period and its early modern era.
Defined by this mix of homegrown traditions and totally new influences from overseas.
Exactly. A real cultural fusion.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over.
Consider how this blending of cultures back in the Momoyama period, Japanese traditions meeting foreign ideas. How did that set the stage for what came next?
Yeah, how did it shape later cultural developments in Japan and how Japan interacted with the rest of the world? What bits of that fusion, that mix, can you still spot in Japan today?
Something interesting to think about as you continue exploring Japanese history.